Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Welcome to this special half-term edition of our live history class series, and I'm so delighted to be welcoming a special guest for the session today. So a big hello to Gemma Smith, who is the Learning and Community Engagement Manager at John Wesley's house. And we're so lucky because she's going to be telling us a bit about John Wesley and his house, and then even taking us on a virtual tour. And hello to everyone who's saying hello in the chat. Hello to Catherine and to Enid as well. I'll hand over to Gemma now, and we will be able to take your questions as we're going through. A reminder that we're recording the session today, but if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and Gemma and I will do our best to get to them. Thanks so much, Gemma.
So hello everyone, my name's Gemma. It's lovely to see you all today. I work at the Museum of Methodism and John Wesley's house, which is in London, and you can see a picture of the museum behind me here. And today we're going to be talking a bit more about who John Wesley was, and also looking around his house. So I'm going to start by just sharing a few slides as an introduction, and then we'll get to look at our virtual tour, which will show us 4 rooms in John Wesley's house and tells us a bit more about how John Wesley lived, but also how the Georgians lived generally. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Here we go. So we're going to start.
If it's okay, we have a question straight away.
Oh yes, right? That's fine, yeah.
I'll just, a question from Enid. Hi Enid.
Hi Enid.
What is that painting behind you?
The picture behind me, so this is a photograph of the Museum of Methodism. So I'm going to move out the way, there we go. So that's what our museum looks like. So I'm actually at my house, but I'm able to put this on as my virtual background. So the museum tells the story about John Wesley, but also Methodism in general. So that's one part of our site, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the other buildings we've got as well. So who was John Wesley? Some of you might have even heard of him before. Now, he was born in the year 1703. And he lived until 1791, so he was actually 87 when he died. So he lived to be quite an old man. And he was a contemporary of Benjamin Franklin, and that means that he lived at the same time. They both lived in London at the same time, but we don't actually know if they ever met. Now, he's most well remembered today for starting a church called the Methodist Church, which is kind of a branch of the Church of England in this country. So that's what he's most well remembered for. And we've got a picture here of John Wesley, and we can see he's wearing a black outfit that's called a Cossack. And you can see he's got these 2 white stripes, and they're his preaching bands. So that's how we can tell from his clothes that he was a minister. So as well as being a Methodist minister, he was a Georgian, and he lived in a Georgian house. And I think Eleanor mentioned that some of you have been joining in with our classes. So hopefully you'll know a bit about the Georgians, but can anyone tell me why it's called the Georgian period? Why do we call it the Georgian times? Does anyone know?
We have a couple of raised hands. I'm going to go to Naomi.
I think it was just, I read about the Georgian period before, and because I think most of the kings, or all of the kings, were called George.
Yeah, well done. So there were 4 kings called George. George the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th, all one after the other. And it started in about 1714 when George I became king, and went on to about 1830, 1837. And 1837 is when Queen Victoria became the queen. And so we call her time period the Victorians, and we call this period the Georgians after the 4 kings. So well done. And this is the site where I usually work. As I said, I've been working at home like a lot of people for the last sort of few months. And on the left here is Wesley's Chapel. And that is a Methodist church, because I remember I said John Wesley was a Methodist minister, and he was one of the main founders of the Methodist Church. And this church was built in 1778, that's when it opened. So it would be a brand new chapel. And John Wesley, before this place was built, lived nearby, another chapel called the Foundry Chapel. And Wesley's Chapel is still open today as a church. It's still got a large Methodist congregation. But of course, at the moment, all the people are meeting virtually, and we hope it can open again soon. So that's Wesley's Chapel. Now, on the same site, just in front of it, is John Wesley's house. And there's a picture of it there in the middle. And that is the building we're going to be looking inside today as part of our virtual tour. And then the last picture on the right-hand side there is another picture of the Museum of Methodism. So that's the inside, and that's our introductory film. That's where you can sit down and watch that there. So that's our main site.
Gemma, we have another raised hand, if that's okay. Another question.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, Enid.
Hi, I have a question. Is John Wesley's house how long is it from? I'm talking about like in the back. Why is it so tall?
Good question. Why is it so tall? So if I just go on to, just check on my next, oh no, I'll talk about it here. So there's actually 5 floors in John Wesley's house, and it's almost the same layout as Benjamin Franklin House. When you go into both the houses, actually they're very similar in their layout. Now, in the Georgian times like today, you have to pay a tax for your house. And in Georgian times, sometimes that tax was determined by how wide your house was. So if you're very wealthy, you might build a very big wide house to show your wealth. But if it was thinner and taller, it meant that the tax was less. So a lot of Georgian townhouses, like Benjamin Franklin House and like our house, are quite narrow but very tall. So there are 5 floors inside, including a kitchen in the basement. So the basement's just below ground level, and then the ground floor, and then 3 further floors. So the rooms are quite small, even though there's 5 floors, and there's about 10 rooms in total, and then 5 smaller rooms on each floor, which is sort of more sort of study size, so quite small rooms. But that might be one of the reasons why some of the houses are very tall and narrow in the Georgian times. So was there any other questions, Eleanor? Was that the last one?
There was one other question that was asking about the Foundry Chapel and whether it was linked, because last week we were talking about the Foundling Hospital. So I don't think they were linked, they just have similar names.
Yeah, that is a good question. So the Foundling Hospital and the Foundry Chapel were very different. So the Foundry Chapel was called that because the building was an old cannon foundry, and a cannon foundry is where big sort of guns from the olden days, the big cannons with the cannonballs, where they were made. Now, when that cannon foundry went out of use, the Methodists actually converted it into a chapel and called it the Foundry Chapel. That building's no longer there. So they built Wesley's Chapel in 1778 because that building was no longer fit for purpose. But John Wesley lived in the Foundry Chapel for a few years, and it was actually very near to where our site is today. But good question. So because we're talking about the Georgians, I just wanted to show you a map of Georgian London from the year 1746, and I'm going to show you some sites here. So this blue dot, that's where John Wesley's house and Wesley's Chapel is today, and it's where the Foundry Chapel was before he lived in the house. And it's very close to Moorfields. You can see there's an L shape below that dot, and they were open fields where people went walking. And it's very near to Old Street Station, which of course wasn't there at this time. There are some other famous landmarks that you might have heard of. The Tower of London is here along the river. And at various times, prisoners were held there, but now also it's got the crown jewels where all the royal family's jewels are kept. And there is a cross-shaped building here, shaped like a big cross, and that is St Paul's Cathedral. So you might have been there or heard of it or seen pictures. It's got the big dome, and again, that's not far from the river. If we go further west in London, there's a road along here that we can see. Now, some of you may have been here or heard of it. It's a very famous shopping street called Oxford Street. Now, if you've been to Oxford Street or seen pictures of it, it's surrounded by buildings today. There's so much going on. It's in central London. But as you can see by looking at the fields here, it's right next, the road here, it's right next to fields in the Georgian time. So London has grown a huge amount since this time. South London, there's hardly any buildings at all really along there. The population in the Georgian period in London was about 750,000 people. Now that sounds like a lot, but today there are around 9 million people living in London. So that just shows you how much it has grown. So I have a question for you. Now I'm sure you'll know this one. This is the river that runs through the middle of London, and who can tell me what that's called?
We have a couple of raised hands. I think one was a question from earlier, so I'll come back to that. And I'll move to another participant. Hello.
Hi, I believe the river is called the River Thames.
Yeah, well done. It's the River Thames. And you might be able to see there are some sort of dots all along the river there. So you can see there's a lot gathered here. It's quite a few along here. So can anyone tell me what they are and why they think there are so many along the river?
Hi, Georgia.
Hi, I think they're boats.
Yeah, well done, they are boats. And why do you think there are so many?
Because they didn't have cars?
Yeah, brilliant, well done. They had no cars, they didn't have trains or planes. And at this time, London was getting things from all over the world. So they'd be sailed into London or other ports, perhaps like Bristol and Liverpool, and the goods would be dropped off in the docks and then transported around the country. So there are lots of boats along the river, much more than today, bringing goods into London and taking them back out again as well. But of course, it was a form of transport because people couldn't get to abroad in other ways. Now, John Wesley actually went on a boat to America when he was a younger man in the 1730s. So people would have also been getting on boats if they were going on long journeys.
I think we still have some hands up. Would it be okay to take some additional questions?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Hi, Enid. Hi, I have a question. How rich was Mr. Wesley?
Was that how rich was Mr. Wesley?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because John Wesley was a church minister. So he wasn't paid an awful lot for his job. And also he had, as a Christian, and part of his faith work was helping others. Now he wanted to help people who were the poorest in cities like London and Bristol and all over the country. So he didn't earn a lot of money from his job, but he was very well educated. In those days, a lot of people didn't get to go to school. A lot of people could never dream of going to university, but John Wesley got to do both. And so he was able to read, which meant he could write books. So he wrote books and he published a lot in his lifetime. So by the time John Wesley was an older man, he actually was quite a wealthy man from all the books and things he published. But a lot of the money that he made himself, he then used it to pay for what he needed and then gave a lot of it back to the church in order to sort of help set up churches and set up the various things that he wanted. So even though he had money, he didn't use it to buy expensive things or luxury things. He used it to put back into his work and his faith and his mission, what he believed. So you wouldn't have seen John Wesley, wearing fancy clothes. He wore his Cossack and his preaching bands in most of the paintings we see. He wouldn't have had expensive foods like chocolate and sugar. And of course, for sugar, he avoided sugar because he was an abolitionist, so he wanted to abolish the slave trade. He believed very strongly in that, so he avoided sugar and things like tea for that reason as well. So he didn't have very luxurious lifestyle, but he did live much more comfortably than most Georgian Londoners at this time. You can't deny that. Okay, so we'll move on to our next slide, and then we'll have a look at our virtual tour. So again, this is John Wesley's house. So this is where we're going to be looking today. We're going to be looking inside at 4 rooms in John Wesley's house. So this house was finished being built in 1779, which is 1 year after Wesley's Chapel opened. And John Wesley moved into it, and it would have been a brand new house. Benjamin Franklin's house is a little bit older, isn't it, Eleanor? I can't remember the date it was built. But like I said, inside, they're very similar with their layout. So it was probably a fairly sort of standard sort of building layout for houses in London at this time. As I said, it was a comfortable home, but it wasn't luxurious. So John Wesley had a kitchen in the basement, and there were 5 floors in total, including the basement. And even though it wasn't luxurious, a lot of people living in London would have never been able to have a house like this. A lot of families would have been living in perhaps 1 or 2 rooms in a shared house, very crowded conditions, with no access to a kitchen or anything like that. So John Wesley was comfortable in his home, and lucky to live where he did. Now, we might sort of think, gosh, that's a big house just for one person to be living in. But John Wesley didn't actually live there alone. Now, he was into his 70s and 80s when he lived in this house. But as a Methodist minister, he travelled all over the country preaching to as many people as he could. So he travelled for maybe 6 months of the year, right up until he died. He was working right up until he died. So a second minister lived in the house with him. So when John Wesley was away, that second minister looked after the church. And we know some of them were married, we know some of them had children. So the house could have been actually quite busy. So it wouldn't have just been Mr. Wesley there alone. They also would have had a housemaid and a cook. So quite a small domestic staff, but domestic staff nonetheless. And the housemaid would have done all sorts of jobs, keeping the house tidy, fireplaces, candles, and things like that. And the cook would have prepared all the meals for the house. And the other thing to remember is, of course, there was no running water in any houses at this time, because there was no sewage system in place that hadn't been invented. So fetching water from a well or a pump would have been something as well that the maid would have done. And it made, obviously, cooking, cleaning and things a lot more difficult than it is today. So I think, yeah, we're going to now do our virtual tour. So I'm just going to stop this share and then go on to our website. So hopefully everybody can see this nice and clearly. This is our virtual tour, and this is the basement of John Wesley's house. So we're just below ground, and you can see the light coming down, but we're just below ground level. So it's actually quite dark down here. Now, things like this heater and these shutters, they're not original. They've been added later. Because it's in the basement, it's very cold. Even in the summer, it's nice and cool down here. So we have got a heater there. But as we look around the kitchen, so this is the kitchen here, and this room, which is now used as a small museum room, probably would have been a sitting room for the cook or the housemaid. But as I look around the kitchen here, what I want you to have a think about is what is different to your kitchen at home. So what can you see missing? What can you see is here that is perhaps not in your kitchen? So this big part here, what do you think that is? There's a small little cupboard here. There's another cupboard there. This big piece of furniture is called a dresser, and that's original to the house. And that's where they kept plates, pots, pans, some on display, some would have just been stacked up. And this large table in the middle was not for eating on, that was for preparing food. Now, we might have kitchen tables where we have our breakfast or dinner. But the kitchen table down here was used for food preparation. They ate upstairs, and we'll see that room later. So does anyone want to share anything that they can see that's different in this kitchen compared to their kitchen at home? Things that are missing, perhaps.
Okay, we have some raised hands.
Yeah.
Hi again, Enid.
Hi, instead of an oven, there's a fireplace to cook the food.
Yeah, well done. So there's no oven. So they would have used an open fire. So there's no stove because they weren't quite coming into houses at this point when John Wesley's house was built. So there would have been an open fire where you would have cooked your food and boiled, any sort of water or anything over. You would have used this open fireplace here. And this big stick here, you could have perhaps put some meat on it and you would have spun that round. But everything would have taken a bit longer to cook in those days. So brilliant. There's no oven and they used their fireplace for cooking. So anything else?
In the chat, Claire Wilson has put no fridge and no waffle maker either.
Yeah, definitely no waffle maker. We definitely wouldn't have had one of those. And there is no fridge. So that meant that it was quite hard to keep food fresh. So not only were you trying to battle against food going off, you also had people selling you food that probably wasn't very good in the first place. So mostly you'd buy food and you'd eat it really not as quickly as you could after you got it. And things like vegetables would last a bit longer, but anything like dairy, meat, you had to eat quite quickly. Now this where it says fire exit, this is a door out into sort of a basement courtyard area. So this cupboard with a stone floor might have been slightly cooler because it was by the back door. Now, whilst it's very cool down here today, you can imagine with this big fireplace and that fire on, it would have actually been quite warm down here, so even harder to keep food cool. So keeping it by the back door was a way you could keep food cool. And people did preserve food. You could dry food, you could salt food, things like jams. They kept a bit longer. So you could preserve food, but things like meat and dairy and cheese and things like that, you had to eat quite quickly. So yeah, no fridge. And any other things that are missing?
We have a couple more raised hands. I'll go to those. Hi, Georgia.
They don't really have a sink.
Yeah, brilliant. Well done. There's no sink because do you remember we said there was no running water? So there would have been no sinks or taps in any houses. So that goes for a bathroom as well. There is no bathroom in John Wesley's house because, there was no flushing toilet or sinks to wash your hands and things. So they would fetch water or maybe get it even delivered to the house on a regular, perhaps daily basis. And then they'd use that. So whilst we might wash every day, they might have a bath maybe once a week because it was a lot more work to get the water warm. Your clothes as well would only be washed once a week. So John Wesley's outer garments, his black sort of cossack we were talking about, so this is one of his, it's actually kind of a day gown, that wouldn't have been washed very often at all. You might just wash any stains off the top, but your undergarments, your underwear, you would wash only once a week because it was so much harder. It took so much longer to wash your clothes. So people were probably a little bit smelly, maybe, in Georgian times. And this little room here, which we can't go in, unfortunately, that's a scullery. And that is where they would have done their washing. The housemaid would have done that once a week.
Since we were talking about the water and no sewage system, Zoe's asked, was there a toilet in the garden?
Yeah, so there was no toilet in the house. A lot of places would have had a privy, which is an outside toilet, and that would have been perhaps a wooden hut. You'd go in and it would really be a hole in the ground. And a cesspit is where the waste would gather, not very nice. And then probably the worst job in Georgian London was the nightmen who would come maybe once a week or every 2 weeks with a cart, empty that waste and it would be shipped out of the city. But the more of you that used a privy, so if you lived in an overcrowded part of London, the more dirt there was, the more likely you were to get sick, the more likely it might contaminate your water supply because people didn't know about germs, so they didn't know that dirt. So the more crowded together you were, the more likely you were to get sick. Saying that, a lot of Georgian Londoners did not drink water like we do today because it wasn't clean enough and it made them sick. So even children would have drank something called small beer, which was a weaker beer, because by brewing the beer, you killed any germs. So most adults would have had beer or wine with their meal, including John Wesley, and even, like I said, children, to kind of avoid getting ill. We've got another 3. So I'm going to now go up to the dining room. So I mentioned that they didn't eat in the kitchen. This was their dining room. So this is where Mr. Wesley and also the other people that lived in the house would have been. So we're on the ground level here. So this is City Road. So that's where John Wesley's house is today, opposite Bunhill Fields. And we can see there's a nice painting above the fireplace. That's Charles Wesley, that's John's younger brother. He was also a Methodist minister and a famous hymn writer. And the hymns are the songs you sing in church. Now, you might have heard of Hark the Herald Angels Sing at Christmas. Charles Wesley wrote that one, as well as thousands of others. We can see a light sort of meal here, set up some cheese, some bread, some fruits. John Wesley didn't have sort of lots of excess and things like that, so he always ate in moderation. We can see out there the stairs, there are lots of stairs in the house. And then I also wanted to point out this strange looking thing here. So does anyone want to have, you've probably got, if someone can have one guess what they think that might be. So it's made of wood, there's some leather here. So anyone want to have a wild guess what they think that might be?
With their hand up. Hello?
My guess is that it's like where you sit down and take your shoes off, or where you sit down and like get someone to clean your shoes or something.
Oh, that's a good guess. That's a really good guess. And there are some chairs like that still exist in London where you sit down. So it is kind of a chair. So that's a good guess. Now, believe it or not, it's actually an 18th century exercise machine. John Wesley was very keen on health and well-being, which you might not associate with him being a minister. Again, he felt it was part of his mission and his work. And what you do is you sit on it. So you sit your bottom on this bit with your back leaning against the wall. You hold on to these handles with your feet. Now this bit comes out so you can sit on it. So you're sat with your back against the wall. And the idea is you bounce up and down on it. This leather bit has springs in. You bounce up and down, and it's supposed to mimic riding a horse. And John Wesley said if you couldn't get out to exercise, if you couldn't get out and walk, you could do this for half an hour each day at home. And we know he had one in his dining room at John Wesley's house. This isn't the original one, but it is one from the time period. So John Wesley was interested in keeping fit and staying healthy and not getting ill in the first place, which we might associate as a modern idea, but actually they did it in the past as well. Next room now. So as I said, this is John Wesley's study, and this is up one more floor, so we can see we're on the first floor now. Now, in houses perhaps like other townhouses, this might be the equivalent of their living room, where you'd welcome guests and sit down, perhaps have tea when visitors came. And it's probably, you know, the fanciest room in the house. It's got the highest ceilings, the biggest windows, and it's a bit like Franklin's parlour at Benjamin Franklin House. But at Franklin's house, this wall is missing, it's not there. So this is the room in the house that's got most of John Wesley's original things in. So when John Wesley died, he was very famous by that time. So they kept a lot of his things, and they went to different places, but some things stayed in the house. So these are his chairs he used. This is a grandfather clock that was given to him. This painting of John Wesley was done when he lived in the house. So this is what he looked like when he lived here. There's this bureau. Does anyone want to guess what a bureau might be used for?
Have some raised hands. Hi, Enid.
Hi, I believe it's for writing and storing things.
Yeah, exactly. So this is John Wesley's writing desk. So it's lovely to have it because he wrote a lot of letters, and as I said, he also wrote books. But of course, letters were the main way to stay in touch in those days because they didn't have things like we have with phones, etc. So letter writing would have been very common. So he would have sat here and written his letters. He also has secret compartments. A lot of bureaus had secret compartments. And we know John Wesley had some private letters that he kept in there. And also he hid some gold coins he had once. And John Wesley's house was broken into. And you know what? They didn't find those gold coins because they were hidden away in the bureau. So these top mirror bits here, they open up this storage. You see lots of little drawers. We've got some feathers in this silver pot here. So what are those feathers? What do we think they are?
Got some raised hands again. Hello?
Hello, I think those feathers are for writing.
Yeah, well done, Naomi. They are for writing. And can you tell me their name?
I'm not quite sure about them.
It begins with a Q.
We have some more raised hands. We'll see if someone else knows.
Isabel.
Hello? Hi, Isabel.
Quill,
One more time.
a quill,
Yeah, a quill. Well done. So a quill is a feather that's being used as a pencil. You dip it in ink and write with it. So that is his writing desk. I'm just going to zoom around here so we can see his lovely bookcase. Here we go. So this was in John Wesley's house when he lived here, and some of his books are actually still on this bookcase that he owned, and there's his notes in them and things that he wrote. And then other books on here were bought later into the collection, so they weren't all John Wesley's, but he was a very keen reader. He read an awful lot, as well as writing books as well. And we'll notice above on the mantelpiece, and in all the rooms actually, there are candles all around the house. So I'm sure lots of people will know this. Why did they have so many candles around the house?
Let me go to one of the hands up. Hello?
Hi, it's because I didn't have many things, for instance, light bulbs and all that. So they'd use the candles to like keep it bright in there.
Yeah, of course. So the electricity, whilst scientists and inventors like Benjamin Franklin, a lot of people were experimenting with electricity at this time. And even John Wesley was doing some experiments with electricity at this time as well. He was interested in it. But people still didn't know how to use electricity in the way we do today. So candles were used for lighting your home. So we talked about the fires being, you know, a potential danger spot, and of course candles were as well. And finally in this room, I wanted to zoom in on this machine in the corner. So it's got 4 legs, so there's some wooden legs. There's a glass canister here with a handle that comes out, and then there's a metal rod here. So what on earth do you think this machine could be used for? Does anyone want to have a guess? Now, it's all right if you don't know, but just any wild guesses what they think this machine might be.
Hi, Naomi.
I think it might be a sewing machine.
Yeah, good guess. Sewing machine. Not quite right, but good guess.
There's one more hand up. I'll go to Enid. Hi, Enid.
Hi. Is it? Do the 2 balls knock into each other? And do they make electricity like they did with Benjamin Franklin's invention?
Oh, interesting. Now that's nearly right. Well done. It is, in fact, an electrical machine. And how it works is there's a handle here, and this is a glass cylinder shape. And you use the handle and you wind it round and round. And this is a piece of fabric over the top, and that creates static electricity, which I think Ellen has talked about probably a few times. So, you know, we've all done the experiment with the balloon on our hair and made it stand out and things like that. So this is because this is metal, it then conducts that static electricity. But you might think, why on earth did John Wesley have an electrical machine in his house? He wasn't a scientist. Now, believe it or not, John Wesley used electricity as medicine. And he thought electricity had a use for people for lots of different types of illness. And this electrical machine would have been used to give people small static shocks on different parts of their body. Because as well as, yes, being a church minister, a lot of chapels at this time, Methodist churches, weren't just places of worship where you went and for your services. Poorer people in different cities could go to Methodist churches and other churches and get things like food, clothing, education, because people had to pay to go to schools. So if you couldn't, some provided free education. But Methodist churches also had medical dispensaries where they gave out medicine. And electricity was one of the medicines that John Wesley gave out to people, from everything to toothache, bruising, paralysis of a limb. He thought that worked well. So he was trying to help people get better by using electricity, and he used it on himself as well. So this machine would have been used at one of the medical dispensaries. So a lot of people know John Wesley because he was a Methodist, but he did have a very big interest in health and well-being as well. So again, it's very interesting.
Sorry, Gemma, just to make the connection with we had a class a couple of weeks ago about society and class. So if anyone here today joined, we talked a bit about the poor laws and how often through churches, things like education and healthcare and food. There'll be workhouses that will be linked to churches. So just linking in with what Gemma was saying there. Yeah, exactly. And as well as having schoolrooms at some of the chapels, John Wesley and early Methodists actually set up schools that are still going today. Kingswood in Bristol is one of the early Methodist schools for Methodist ministers' children. So John Wesley wasn't from a rich family. He got to go to school on a scholarship that someone paid for and university. And I think he felt like he owed it because he had all that luck to try and help other people as well. And like Eleanor said, a lot of churches filled that role at this time. So we're going to go into the final room, which is the bedroom, and this is on the same floor, just next door. Now we can see out the window there, that's Wesley's chapel. This is those little side rooms we were talking about. And this one, and we can't go in any further, is John Wesley's prayer room. And he got up for an hour at 4 a.m. every day, got up at 4 a.m, prayed for an hour before going and doing his service or whatever he was doing that day. So that's his prayer room. And this is his bedroom, so he's got a little bed there. Now there's no wardrobe because they didn't have wardrobes in these days, so they would have had chest of drawers for their clothing. Again, storage for books, the fireplace. That's another Methodist minister who was a contemporary of Wesley as well. So it's quite a small room. Now someone mentioned the toilet earlier, going outside to the toilet. But what about at night time? Because remember, there was no electricity, so you didn't want to light a candle, go all the way downstairs and then go outside in the dark. So, you know, what if you needed the loo in the night time? They had to use something called a chamber pot, which really is like a big potty made of ceramic. And so you'd go to the loo in the night, and then the one in John Wesley's house was stored away in this cupboard here. So the poor housemaid, it was her job in the morning to come up and pick that up and take that down and outside. So not very nice for her. But most people would have had a chamber pot in their room if they needed to go in the night time. And we can then see the bed. Now this isn't John Wesley's bed. This one's actually 18th century, so the same time period, but it didn't belong to John Wesley. We don't know where that one went. And I'll show you a painting of John Wesley's bedroom, because this is actually the room that John Wesley died in. Again, it wasn't, we might think that's a bit strange today because we go to the hospital so much more, but in this time it was fairly normal because we didn't have the same kind of hospital care we did today. And John Wesley was 87 when he died, and he died really just related to old age. So this is his bedroom here. Now, one thing I wanted to quickly ask was about these curtains around the bed, and ask if anyone had any guesses why there were curtains around the bed. Enid has a raised hand. Hi, Enid.
It keeps the cold out, and it also gives you more privacy when you're getting dressed.
Yeah, well done. So all the windows in John Wesley's house are single glazed, still the same to this day. So it's like at Benjamin Franklin house. It's very cold in the winter, and on a windy day you can sometimes feel the breeze. So even with their fireplaces, of course, there was no central heating, so they're quite cold houses. So these curtains help keep that draft out, keep you a bit warmer. And of course, you mentioned privacy. Now, John Wesley would have been in this room alone, but for some people, they would have shared their bedroom with other people. So, you know, again, having the curtains around would indeed have given some privacy. So that's very good. So what I'm going to do is that's all the rooms I was going to show you today. And I was quickly just going to go back to my presentation, just to show you. Here we go. So we talked about candles, didn't we, and how people use candles to light their home. And I just quickly wanted to show you pictures of different types of candles that people used in the 18th century. So a beeswax candle would have been much more expensive, so mainly the wealthy would have used those. But they were made of beeswax, so they smelled much nicer, they lasted longer, but of course they were much more expensive. So a lot of people made their own candles. And the picture on the right there is a tallow candle, but the thing is they're made with animal fat, so you dip a wick in animal fat again and again until it got wide enough. So they were very cheap to make, but they were very smelly and very smoky and not very nice, but of course they're a lot cheaper. So at John Wesley's house, they probably would have had a bit of a mixture because they wouldn't have wanted to spend too much money on candles. Now, if you can imagine our light in our evenings in our house, it would have been very difficult to light your house in the same way using candles, and very expensive. So a lot of people just went to bed a bit earlier because it was too dark really to do anything else. Now this is from talking about the dining room. And if we look on the left-hand picture here, this is a picture of a table setting from a wealthy Georgian Londoner's dinner party. And there are about 25 plates of food for one course. So there was a big difference between the very wealthy and the sort of normal people living at this time. And John Wesley didn't approve of how much money people sometimes did spend when they were very rich on these kind of luxuries, when some people couldn't even afford to have one meal. So this is just a course for a suggested dinner party, and perhaps for a wealthy Georgian Londoner. And then sort of a daily diet of a sort of, you know, someone who was working in London at the time: 2 penny loaves of bread, about 200 grams of meat, which is the same as about 2.5 apples, some cheese, and maybe some broth, which is a type of soup almost. But that would have to feed more than one person, perhaps 2 to 3 in a family. And I just wanted to show you this because this is, whilst you might think it's a sad picture, it's a big painting we've got in our museum. It's John Wesley actually on his deathbed, and that was kind of seen as a celebrated thing. And it's actually supposed to be in John Wesley's bedroom, but we've just seen that bedroom and seen how small it is. So we would think, goodness me, how would all these people fit in? And the truth is they wouldn't have. And the way the bed is and the layout of the room isn't really like John Wesley's house today. So when we're looking at paintings from the past, sometimes it's just good to remember that perhaps it's someone that's imagined that scene and then painted it from that, rather than perhaps telling the exact story of what happened, because we know, we've seen the room, we know this was probably unlikely to happen. But all these people in this painting were real people, and it might have been that they visited him up, you know, whilst he was poorly at different times, but it's unlikely everyone would have gathered round like this at the time. Okay, so that's, I'll stop sharing now, and again, if there's any questions just to finish with, otherwise we'll wrap up there.
Gosh, thank you so much, Gemma. That was just amazing. It really, and what you were just saying about the painting, we've spoken a bit in the classes about sources. We've talked about how artwork is an important source, but Gemma's quite right. It's important to remember that sometimes they don't show the exact truth. They're trying to depict something that wasn't exactly reality. It's lovely to have your comments. Thank you for your thank yous in the chat. And just to say, that was just wonderful. It really brought to life the Georgian home with the virtual tour. Some of you may have visited Benjamin Franklin House. If you haven't, then we do have a virtual tour. I'll put the link in the chat. As Gemma said, it's very similar in design and layout to John Wesley's house, but we don't currently have the furniture in the house. But with the virtual tour, there's also something called a virtual Georgian interior, which is a kind of impression of what the rooms might have looked like with furniture, although we don't know for sure. So do enjoy having a look at that. And we wanted to suggest an activity that you might like to do after the class. So you might like to make your own model Georgian house. So for this, I've got an example here. So you need a cereal box or a shoe box, and some paper and coloured pencils or coloured pens. And you would have a look at John Wesley's house on the website, or Benjamin Franklin House on the website, to look at the design, so you can copy the window shapes and the bricks and the shape of the door as well. And then if it's an opening box, you might also be able to do some of the rooms inside and think about the different furniture that you saw at John Wesley's house that you could include in your house. So hopefully you might be able to have a go at that at home. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much again, Gemma. That was really such a treat. We're so grateful to you for doing this.
No, thank you for having me. And again, thank you everyone for their really interesting questions. It was lovely to hear from everyone today.
And please do have a look at the John Wesley's House website. There's some great resources on there, including one about John Wesley and health. Is that right? That's up there.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about. So thanks so much, everyone. Bye. Have a good evening.
Everyone. Bye-bye.